In the spring of 2026, a team of geneticists sat down with the genomes of 78 ancient skeletons pulled from a burial complex in Yongsan, in southeastern Korea, and what they found made several of them stop and reread the data twice. This wasn't just a tomb, it was a system, an entire hidden social machine buried underground for over 1500 years, and buried alongside it was a truth that the people who built these tombs had never intended anyone to uncover. Scientists mapping out the family relationships hidden inside this ancient DNA discovered 11 pairs of first-degree relatives, 23 pairs of second-degree relatives, and 20 pairs of even more distant relatives, all tangled together inside a burial ground built and used within roughly a single century, between the 4th and 6th centuries CE, and scattered among these carefully arranged tombs were something far darker than ordinary graves, individuals whose burials marked them not as honored ancestors, but as human sacrifices, buried alongside the very people who may have ordered their deaths. For 1500 years, the soil kept this secret buried. Then modern genetics cracked it open, and what came out forced historians to rethink not just who these ancient Koreans were, but how their entire society had actually been built. To understand why this discovery matters so much, and why it's only one piece of a much bigger genetic mystery buried across the entire Korean Peninsula, you have to go back thousands of years earlier, long before kingdoms, before written language, before anyone had a word for Korea at all. For decades, the exact origins of the Korean people remained a genuinely unresolved scientific puzzle. Researchers openly admitted that although Koreans were understood to be an ethnic group formed from the blending of northern and southern subgroups, the exact genetic origins of those two groups remained unclear, and there had never been a proper genome-scale analysis exploring exactly where, when, and how that ancient blending actually happened on the Korean Peninsula itself. This wasn't a small gap in knowledge. This was one of the most basic questions about an entire nation's ancestry sitting unanswered for years, hidden behind acidic Korean soil that destroys bone and DNA far more aggressively than the cooler, drier conditions found in parts of Europe or Siberia. The first real crack in this mystery appeared in February of 2017, when researchers from the Ulsan National Institute of Science and Technology, working alongside teams from Cambridge University, the Russian Academy of Sciences, and the University of Potsdam in Germany, announced the results of a genome analysis pulled from a human skull discovered inside the Devil's Gate cave, located in Russia's Far East, close to the Korean Peninsula. Ancient humans are believed to have lived inside that cave somewhere between 7,000 and 9,000 years ago, meaning the skull had been sitting in darkness for the better part of 9 millennia before anyone managed to read what was hidden inside its bones. When researchers finally sequenced its genome, they found something remarkable, a set of genetic markers that connected this ancient hunter-gatherer directly to modern Korean people living today. The team discovered shared physical traits still visibly present in modern Koreans, including brown eyes and a distinctive shovel-shaped structure to the incisor teeth, alongside a set of genetic markers common across modern East Asian populations more broadly, including variants tied to difficulty digesting milk, susceptibility to high blood pressure, weaker body odor, and drier earlobes. In other words, a person who lived and died 9,000 years ago, inside a remote cave far from any modern city, was carrying genetic fingerprints still walking around inside millions of Korean bodies today. The study's overall conclusion was just as striking. Researchers determined that the gene structure of modern Koreans had been shaped by influence from both northern and southern neighboring populations across thousands of years, and that genetically speaking, modern Koreans actually trace closer to southern Asian populations than many people would expect. That single discovery, as important as it was, only opened up a much bigger and messier question. If modern Koreans carry this deep dual heritage, blending northern and southern genetic influences, where exactly did each half of that equation actually come from, and when did they combine? Researchers already knew that Koreans belonged to the broader Altaic language family, sharing deep linguistic and ethnic ties with neighboring populations across Northeast Asia, including the Chinese and Japanese, and that the modern Korean population spread across roughly 85 million people worldwide, including 51 million in South Korea, 25 million in North Korea, and 7 million more scattered across the globe, showed no evidence of any severe historical genetic bottleneck, unlike some more isolated populations. But beyond that basic framework, the fine details remained frustratingly murky. Studying the Korean Y chromosome specifically, scientists identified a haplogroup known as O2bs or Y465, a genetic marker suggesting that the ancestors of Proto-Koreans were closely related to populations who inhabited northeastern China during the Neolithic period, somewhere between roughly 9,900 and 10,000 years before present, later followed by additional genetic contributions arriving during the Bronze Age, between roughly 3,450 and 2,350 years ago. That 10,000-year figure is not some rounded, casual estimate either. It represents a genuine scientific dating point marking exactly how far back the deepest measurable roots of Proto-Korean ancestry can currently be traced using Y chromosome analysis alone. A full 10 millennia of hidden lineage quietly passed down, father to son, long before Korea existed as any kind of unified cultural or political concept. Mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed down exclusively through the maternal line, told a related but distinctly different story, showing that Koreans display an extremely typical East Asian genetic profile on that side of the family tree. This split, distinct patterns showing up on the paternal Y chromosome side compared to the maternal mitochondrial side, was itself a clue that something complicated had happened deep in Korea's genetic past. Different ancestral populations contributing unevenly to different parts of the modern Korean genome depending on whether you trace back through mothers or through fathers. Researchers eventually confirmed that Koreans primarily consist of two major genetic components, with one clearly and strongly linked to Chinese populations, while the second component remained stubbornly less clear, resistant to easy categorization even after years of study. It took a much larger, more ambitious genomic project to finally start pulling that second, blurrier component into focus. Researchers eventually compared 88 modern Korean genomes against 91 other present-day populations from across Asia, and layered on top of that an additional analysis of 115 ancient genomes spanning an enormous stretch of time, from Pleistocene-era hunter-gatherers all the way through to Iron Age farmers. What emerged from crunching all of that data together was a genuinely fascinating picture, showing two major genetic components running through modern Korean DNA, one tracing back to East Siberia, the other tracing back to Southeast Asia. Even more specifically, the analysis revealed a slow, gradual admixture process unfolding across thousands of years, blending genetic ancestry connected to an ancient 40,000-year-old individual known as Tianyuan man, discovered in China, together with ancestry connected to that same 8,000-year-old Devil's Gate population, spreading and mixing gradually across East Asia and East Siberia all the way through the Neolithic era. Perhaps most surprisingly, when researchers compared modern Korean genomes against ancient populations from Japan, they found that among all non-Japanese populations studied, Koreans showed the single highest degree of genetic similarity to an ancient Yao period individual excavated from the Doigahama site in Japan. A finding that quietly hinted at just how deeply intertwined the ancient histories of the Korean Peninsula and the Japanese archipelago actually were, long before either nation existed in anything resembling its modern form. That hint became far more concrete in October of 2024, when a joint research team led by Jong-Yoon Kim and Jun Ohashi at the University of Tokyo published findings that finally settled a question anthropologists had been circling for years. Analyzing the complete genome of an actual Yao period individual, someone who lived roughly 2,300 years ago, the team demonstrated clearly that the majority of immigration into the Japanese archipelago during both the Yao and Kofun periods, an enormous stretch of history running from roughly 3000 BC all the way to 538 AD, actually originated specifically from the Korean Peninsula. Among every non-Japanese population tested, this ancient Yao individual's genome bore the closest resemblance specifically to modern Korean populations. This wasn't just an academic footnote. It meant that one of the most transformative population movements in East Asian history, the wave of rice farming migrants who fundamentally reshaped Japanese society thousands of years ago, traced back overwhelmingly to people who had lived on the Korean Peninsula first, carrying their genes, their farming techniques, and quite possibly entire family units across the sea to settle in a foreign archipelago. But if you really want to understand how strange and layered Korea's hidden genetic history actually is, you have to look at what happened when scientists finally got their hands on genuine ancient nuclear genomes from the heart of one of Korea's most historically important eras, the Three Kingdoms period. Announced in the summer of 2022, This research focused specifically on 8 individuals recovered from the Three Kingdoms period, dated to the 4th and 5th centuries CE, pulled from two significant funerary complexes located in Gimhae, a city that once served as the political and trading heart of the Gaia Confederacy, a powerful alliance of small states that existed alongside, but separate from, Korea's 3 major kingdoms of Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla. Scientists had a specific and pressing question driving this research. They wanted to understand exactly how much lingering genetic legacy from the ancient Jomon population of Japan had actually persisted inside the Korean Peninsula, and whether the historical spread of advanced technology and culture from northern China into Korea over the centuries had happened primarily through actual population migration, real people physically moving and mixing, or simply through the gradual spread of ideas and trade goods without much direct genetic exchange at all. What the DNA revealed was messier, more human, and considerably more unsettling than anyone expected. Rather than showing a single, uniform genetic population living neatly across the Gaia region, researchers found genuine genetic heterogeneity among the 8 individuals studied. Distinct differences in ancestry sitting side by side within the very same burial complexes. Some of these individuals were clearly identified through archaeology as tomb owners, people of significant status and wealth. Others, chillingly, were identified as human sacrifices, buried specifically to accompany the dead into whatever afterlife these ancient Koreans believed existed. And at least one of the 8, a child, was found buried inside a shell mound, a distinctive type of funerary monument typically associated with Southeast Asian burial traditions rather than privileged Korean elites. A burial style researchers noted was specifically not associated with high-status individuals. Here is where the science delivered its most genuinely startling twist. When researchers compared the genetic backgrounds of the tomb owners against the genetic backgrounds of the human sacrifices buried alongside them, they found no meaningful difference at all. Anthropologist Per Galabert, one of the researchers involved in the study, explained the finding directly, stating plainly that individual genetic differences observed among these remains were not correlated to grave typology, meaning the type or status of a person's burial gave no reliable clue about their genetic ancestry whatsoever. Even more pointedly, Galabert noted that the team observed no clear genetic difference between the grave owners and the human sacrifices found buried alongside them. Sit with that for a moment. Whoever these ancient Koreans chose to kill and bury as sacrificial offerings for their elite dead were not some genetically distinct, separately identifiable underclass or captured foreign population, easily distinguished by ancestry from the ruling families who ordered their deaths. Genetically, they were essentially indistinguishable from the very people they were sacrificed to serve. Whatever divided these individuals into master and sacrifice in the eyes of Three Kingdoms period Korean society, it was not ancestry, and it was not bloodline. It was something else entirely, some social, political, or economic distinction that has left absolutely no trace in the genetic record, leaving modern researchers with an unsettling gap between what the bones can prove and what actually decided who lived free and who was buried as an offering. This same research also finally helped resolve the lingering mystery over ancient Jomon influence inside Korea. The genetic data confirmed measurable legacy contributions consistent with ancient Jomon ancestry surviving inside these Three Kingdoms period individuals, providing hard genomic evidence supporting a much more complicated, two-way flow of people and genes across the sea separating the Korean Peninsula from the Japanese archipelago, rather than a simple, one-directional spread of culture and technology moving quietly from the mainland outward without any accompanying human migration. And then, on top of the genetic ancestry itself, researchers layered something almost eerie, an actual attempt to look these ancient people directly in the face. Using detailed DNA-based facial feature prediction techniques, scientists generated the first published facial reconstructions of ancient individuals built entirely from genetic data alone, without any physical skull or forensic clay modeling involved, an approach never before applied to remains from this specific historical period. The results confirmed something reassuringly simple amid all the surrounding strangeness, that these Three Kingdoms period Koreans, whether tomb owner or human sacrifice, closely resembled modern Korean people living today, a striking, almost intimate reminder that separated by roughly 1600 years of history, the basic physical identity of the Korean people has remained remarkably, visibly consistent, even as the deeper genetic story hidden underneath that familiar face turned out to be far stranger and more tangled than anyone expected. Which brings the story full circle, back to that most recent and most unsettling discovery from 2026, the Imdangjuang burial complex in Gyeongsan. Remember, this wasn't simply a single grave or a small handful of related burials. This was a massive, densely interconnected network of family relationships, 11 first-degree relative pairs, meaning parents, children, or full siblings, 23 second-degree relative pairs, covering grandparents, aunts, uncles, or half-siblings, and 20 additional pairs connected through more distant, third-degree or further family ties, all packed into a burial ground actively used across roughly a single century. That density of kinship, that many overlapping family branches, all buried together within such a tight window of time, points toward a society organized around extremely close, tightly bound family networks controlling and maintaining this particular burial ground, likely reflecting a ruling elite that intentionally kept power, land, and burial rights concentrated within an extended family structure across multiple overlapping generations. A practice with unmistakable echoes of the kind of endogamy, marriage kept carefully within an existing family or social group that shows up again and again throughout ancient societies obsessed with preserving bloodline purity and consolidating inherited power. And scattered throughout this same tightly bound family network, just as with the earlier Gaia Confederacy findings, were the remains of human sacrifice victims, individuals whose deaths were apparently considered a necessary part of honoring and burying the society's most powerful families. The sheer scale of this particular kinship network, spanning 54 separate documented relative pairs across 3 different degrees of family closeness, all uncovered within a single research project, represents one of the most detailed pictures ever assembled of exactly how an ancient Korean ruling class organized itself around blood, marriage, and death, a picture that, until modern DNA sequencing technology finally caught up enough to read it, had remained completely invisible, buried in silence for roughly 1,500 years. Step back now and look at the complete, sprawling shape of this story, because very few countries have had their deepest ancestral secrets cracked open so dramatically, and so recently, as Korea. A 9,000-year-old skull sealed inside a remote cave near the Russian Far East turned out to be quietly carrying the same brown eyes, the same distinctive tooth structure, and the same core genetic markers still present in millions of Korean people walking around today. A Y chromosome marker tracing back a full 10,000 years connects every modern Korean man, through an unbroken paternal line, to Neolithic populations who lived in northeastern China long before anyone had invented the concept of a Korean nation at all. Ancient DNA extracted directly from Three Kingdoms period tombs revealed that Korea's elite society sacrificed human beings who were, genetically speaking, virtually indistinguishable from the very rulers they were killed to serve, exposing a brutal social hierarchy that left no trace whatsoever inside the biological record. Cross-border migration between the Korean Peninsula and Japan turned out to run far deeper and far earlier than anyone previously proved, with actual Yao period genomes confirming that the ancestors of countless modern Japanese people originated specifically from Korea, not some vague, generalized mainland Asian population. And most recently of all, a single tightly interconnected burial ground near Gyeongsan revealed an entire hidden family empire, dozens of blood relatives buried together across a single century, quietly preserving and consolidating power through carefully maintained bloodlines, with human sacrifice apparently baked directly into how that power was maintained and honored. None of these secrets were hidden through any deliberate act of concealment. Nobody buried these bones intending for them to stay silent forever. The silence was simply a byproduct of time itself, thousands of years passing quietly over acidic Korean soil that destroys organic material far more aggressively than researchers would prefer, layered on top of the simple technological limitation that, until shockingly recently, no scientific method existed capable of reading a genome from bones that old and that poorly preserved. It took cutting-edge genome sequencing technology, painstakingly developed and refined across the past 2 decades, to finally give these ancient bones back their voice, allowing them to speak clearly for the very first time about who actually built ancient Korean society, who was sacrificed to serve it, and just how far back, measured now in the tens of thousands of years, the true roots of the Korean people genuinely reach. And researchers are clear that this story is still very much unfinished. Every new ancient genome pulled from Korean soil carries the very real potential to add another chapter, or overturn an existing one entirely, to a national origin story that, until just the last few years, remained almost completely unread.